You already decided I'm guilty before I even spoke, didn't you? Funny, no one asked what I know about the law. Judge me if you want, but listen first.
The courtroom doors creaked open, and every head turned at once. Conversations faded, papers stopped rustling, and a heavy silence settled across the room as 18-year-old Tyson Cole stepped inside. To most people there, he looked ordinary, maybe even out of place. A simple gray shirt, worn shoes, and a calm expression that didn't match the tension in the air. But what truly shaped their judgment wasn't his clothes. It was the color of his skin, the label defendant beside his name, and the assumption that came with it. In their eyes, he was already guilty. The judge barely glanced at the case file before forming an opinion. The prosecutor leaned back confidently, convinced this would be another quick conviction. Even the officers at the back of the courtroom exchanged knowing looks, as if they had seen this story play out 100 times before. A young black teenager accused of theft? Open and shut case. No one expected resistance. No one expected intelligence. And certainly no one expected a fight. Judge Arthur Pembry sat high above everyone else, his posture rigid, his expression cold and impatient. Years on the bench had hardened him, and his reputation preceded him. He believed in swift judgments, strict sentences, and little sympathy. As Tyson approached the defense table, the judge finally looked up, studying him with a mix of irritation and quiet contempt. Without even hearing a word, he had already decided what kind of person Tyson must be. He cleared his throat and called the case, his voice echoing sharply across the chamber. The charge was serious, grand larceny, the theft of valuable corporate technology. The prosecutor wasted no time painting a picture of guilt, speaking with rehearsed certainty. He described access, fingerprints, opportunity, and motive, crafting a narrative that felt convincing, even airtight. Each word pushed Tyson further into the box they had built for him. Poor, desperate, and reckless. Someone who would take what he didn't deserve. Someone who didn't belong in a place of law and order. Tyson, however, remained still. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He simply listened. His silence made the judge impatient. Well, Pembry scoffed, leaning forward. Are you planning to say anything, or should we assume you understand the seriousness of your situation? A few people chuckled under their breath. The prosecutor smirked. Even Tyson's assigned public defender shifted uncomfortably, whispering for him to accept a plea deal before things got worse. 5 years, maybe less if he cooperated. It was presented as mercy. The judge's eyes narrowed as Tyson continued to stand quietly, his calmness mistaken for fear or confusion. Son, the judge added with a hint of mockery, this isn't a classroom. You can't stay silent and hope the problem disappears. The room felt heavier with every passing second, filled with expectation. They were waiting for him to fold, to apologize, to confirm their assumptions. But Tyson's silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Inside his mind, every detail mattered. The wording of the charges, the tone of the prosecutor, the impatience of the judge. He observed everything, storing it away like evidence. He understood the system better than they realized. He knew how quickly people formed opinions and how rarely they questioned them. And he knew that once he spoke, everything would change. For years, he had studied law quietly, obsessively, while balancing responsibilities most teenagers never faced. Nights spent working, days spent learning, sacrifices made without recognition. This moment wasn't an accident. It was the collision of preparation and injustice. Yet no one in that courtroom saw it coming. To them, he was still just a kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. The judge finally lost patience. He leaned back, shaking his head with visible frustration. If you have no defense, he said bluntly, we'll proceed accordingly. The words hung in the air like a verdict already decided. Tyson slowly raised his head, his eyes steady and focused, and for the first time, he looked directly at the judge. There was no fear in his expression, no anger, only clarity. the kind that made people uncomfortable because it refused to fit the role they had assigned him. The courtroom grew quiet again, sensing a shift that no one could yet explain. Something was different now. The assumptions, the mockery, the quiet confidence of the prosecution. It all hovered on the edge of collapse. And in that moment, before a single word left his mouth, Tyson Cole stopped being just another defendant. He became a question no one in that courtroom was prepared to answer. The silence stretched across the courtroom as Tyson finally straightened his posture and stepped forward, no longer blending into the background as just another nervous teenager. His public defender leaned toward him again, whispering urgently, trying to convince him to accept the plea deal before the judge's patience ran out. It was the safer choice, the easier path, the one most defendants in his position took. But Tyson gently shook his head. He wasn't interested in shortcuts. He wasn't there to bargain for mercy over something he didn't do. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and unexpectedly confident. It didn't carry the hesitation people expected from someone his age. Instead, it carried control. "Your Honor," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "I would like to represent myself." The words hit the courtroom like a sudden crack of thunder. His defender blinked in shock. The prosecutor frowned. Judge Pembry leaned forward, his expression shifting from boredom to disbelief. "You want to represent yourself?" the judge repeated, a hint of amusement creeping into his voice. A few people in the gallery exchanged smirks, convinced this would be a disaster. Representing oneself in a serious felony case was risky even for trained professionals. For an 18-year-old accused of theft, it sounded almost absurd. The judge removed his glasses, wiping them slowly, as if giving Tyson a chance to reconsider. "Son," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm, "this isn't a school debate. This is a courtroom. People with years of experience struggle in here." But Tyson didn't back down. He stood tall, meeting the judge's gaze without hesitation. "I understand the risks," he replied, "but it is my legal right, and I choose to proceed." His confidence unsettled the room. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. And certainty, coming from someone they had already dismissed, made them uncomfortable. The prosecutor was the first to recover. He quickly stood, eager to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the state is ready to proceed. The evidence speaks for itself." He began outlining the case again, emphasizing Tyson's job as a janitor at the tech company, his access to the building, and the fingerprints found near the equipment that had gone missing. Each point was delivered like a hammer strike, building the illusion of inevitability. The jury listened closely, nodding at certain moments. From the outside, the story sounded logical. A low-paid employee, surrounded by valuable technology, tempted by opportunity. The prosecutor spoke with practiced rhythm, shaping Tyson into a stereotype rather than a person. And for a moment, it seemed to work. The room settled back into its earlier confidence, reassured that the system was still in control. Then it was Tyson's turn. He didn't rush. He walked to the center of the courtroom, carrying only a thin folder. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, just quiet composure. When he began speaking, the tone was different from anything the room had heard that day. Clear, precise, and measured, like someone who understood not only the law, but the weight of every word. "The prosecution is correct about one thing," he said. "I was in that building. My fingerprints were there." A murmur spread through the room. The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. But Tyson continued before anyone could react. "However, presence does not equal guilt. Access does not equal theft. And fingerprints, without context, are not proof of intent." The language was sharp, structured, unmistakably legal. The prosecutor's confident smile faded slightly. As the courtroom settled after the initial shock of Jamal's confident opening, the judge leaned forward, no longer amused. The smirk that had once lingered on his face faded into a cautious stare. The prosecutor shuffled through his papers, clearly unsettled by the unexpected turn of events. Jamal stood tall, his hands steady, his voice calm but firm. He began laying out facts, precise, structured, and impossible to ignore. He cited legal precedents, quoted constitutional rights, and pointed out procedural errors that had occurred during his arrest. Each statement landed like a hammer, forcing the room to listen. People who had once dismissed him now watched closely, their expressions shifting from doubt to curiosity. Even the court reporter paused briefly, as if realizing she was documenting something far more significant than a routine case. Jamal explained how he had been stopped without probable cause, how assumptions were made based solely on his appearance, and how his words had been twisted into something they were not. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. Instead, he spoke with clarity and control, as though he had spent years preparing for this very moment. He referenced case law with ease, explaining how similar situations had been ruled unlawful, and how his rights had been violated at multiple stages. The prosecutor attempted to interrupt, but Jamal respectfully asked to finish, quoting courtroom protocol and earning a nod from the judge himself. That nod alone shifted the power in the room. The judge was no longer laughing. He was listening. Murmurs began to spread quietly through the audience. Some leaned toward each other, whispering in disbelief. Others simply stared, realizing that this teenager wasn't just defending himself. He was dismantling an entire narrative that had been built against him. Jamal then presented evidence, a timeline of events, inconsistencies in officer statements, and overlooked details that painted a very different picture from the one initially presented. Every piece connected logically, forming a clear argument that left little room for doubt. It became painfully obvious that this case had never been as simple as it seemed. What had started as a situation many assumed would end quickly was now turning into a lesson on accountability. The judge finally spoke, his tone measured, almost cautious. He asked Jamal where he had learned to understand the law in such depth. The question hung in the air, carrying more respect than anyone expected. Jamal paused before answering, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling back on the bench. He spoke about late nights in the library, about studying legal textbooks he borrowed because he couldn't afford them, about watching courtroom proceedings online and taking notes. He explained how witnessing injustice in his community pushed him to learn, to prepare, and to believe that knowledge was the only way to fight back. There was no arrogance in his words, only determination and honesty. For a moment, the courtroom felt different. The tension that once felt heavy now carried something else, realization. The people present weren't just watching a case anymore. They were witnessing someone challenge the assumptions that had shaped how he was treated from the moment he walked in. The judge's expression softened, and even the prosecutor's posture shifted, less defensive and more reflective. Jamal wasn't just proving his innocence. He was exposing how quickly people judge based on appearance, age, and bias. And with every sentence, he was forcing the system itself to confront that truth. As he continued, Jamal made it clear that this wasn't about revenge or embarrassment. He wasn't trying to shame anyone. He wanted fairness, nothing more, nothing less. He spoke about respect, about how young people deserved to be heard rather than dismissed, and how justice meant looking beyond assumptions. His words carried weight not because they were emotional, but because they were grounded in fact and delivered with purpose. The courtroom, once filled with quiet laughter and doubt, had transformed into a place of deep attention. Every person present knew they were watching something rare, a teenager standing alone, armed only with knowledge and courage, reshaping the direction of his own story. By now, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had completely changed. What began as a routine hearing, one many expected to end quickly, had turned into a moment of reflection for everyone present. The judge, once dismissive, now listened with an intensity that showed genuine interest. The prosecutor no longer appeared confident. Instead, he seemed careful, almost hesitant, as if weighing every word before speaking. Jamal stood in the center of it all, composed and unwavering. The laughter that had greeted him earlier felt like a distant memory. In its place was silence, heavy, attentive, and filled with respect. Every movement, every breath, every word now carried weight. Jamal continued presenting his argument, now shifting from defense to purpose. He explained how situations like his weren't rare, how many young people, especially those from marginalized communities, walked into courtrooms already judged before their cases even began. He spoke about stereotypes, how they quietly influence decisions, how they shape expectations, and how they create barriers long before the truth is even heard. His voice didn't shake. Instead, it carried a calm strength that made every sentence feel intentional. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for every person who had ever felt unheard, underestimated, or dismissed. The judge asked a few questions, this time respectfully. He wanted clarification on certain legal points Jamal had raised. And Jamal responded with the same confidence, referencing legal standards, due process, and rights guaranteed under the Constitution. It became clear that this wasn't memorization. This was understanding. Real, deep understanding. The kind that comes from effort, curiosity, and determination. The courtroom staff exchanged glances, quietly acknowledging what they were witnessing. A teenager, standing alone without a legal team, demonstrating the skill and discipline of a trained attorney. Then came a moment no one expected. The judge removed his glasses, paused, and addressed Jamal directly, not as a defendant, but as an individual. His tone had changed entirely. He acknowledged the clarity of Jamal's argument and the professionalism in his presentation. It wasn't an apology, but it was close. It carried the weight of recognition. For the first time since Jamal walked into that room, the power dynamic had shifted completely. The boy who had been laughed at was now being taken seriously by the highest authority in the room. Jamal didn't react with pride or anger. Instead, he remained focused. He explained that his goal was never to prove anyone wrong. It was to prove that he deserved to be heard. That justice should be based on facts, not assumptions. He spoke about how he dreamed of becoming an attorney one day, not for status or recognition, but to help people who couldn't defend themselves. People who didn't know the law. People who were too afraid to speak. The sincerity in his voice made the room still. Even those who had doubted him earlier now watched with a quiet sense of admiration. The prosecutor finally spoke again, but his tone had softened. He reviewed the evidence Jamal had presented and admitted that there were inconsistencies that needed to be addressed. It was a subtle but significant shift. The narrative was no longer one-sided. The system that had seemed so certain of Jamal's guilt was now reconsidering. And for the first time, it felt like fairness had a chance to enter the room. The audience, some strangers, some community members, sat quietly, absorbing everything. What they were witnessing wasn't just a legal defense. It was a moment of transformation, a reminder that intelligence, discipline, and courage can break through prejudice. That sometimes the people society underestimates the most are the ones capable of changing how it thinks. Jamal had walked into the courtroom as a teenager being judged. But now he stood as something more, a voice, a challenger of assumptions, and a symbol of what happens when knowledge meets opportunity. And as the proceedings moved forward, one thing became undeniable. The story was no longer about a case. It was about growth, accountability, and the power of being seen for who you truly are. The courtroom, once filled with doubt, had become a place of realization. And everyone present knew that whatever happened next, they had already witnessed something that would stay with them long after the verdict was spoken. The final moments of the hearing carried silence unlike anything that had filled the courtroom before. It wasn't the tense silence of uncertainty or the impatient quiet of people waiting for a quick decision. It was reflective, heavy with realization. The judge looked down at the case file for a long moment, then back at Jamal. His expression, once filled with quiet amusement, now carried something closer to respect. The entire room seemed to pause, aware that whatever was about to be said would not just end a case, but define everything that had unfolded. Jamal stood calmly, hands at his sides, his posture steady, his face composed. He had said everything he needed to say. There was no desperation in his eyes, no fear, only confidence and patience. The judge finally spoke, his voice measured and firm. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made, not only in the handling of the case, but in the assumptions that surrounded it from the beginning. He admitted that the courtroom had witnessed something rare, a young man who refused to be defined by prejudice, who chose knowledge over anger, and dignity over frustration. The words carried weight not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. The judge emphasized that justice requires listening, fairness, and accountability, and that these principles must apply to everyone equally. He then addressed the inconsistencies Jamal had exposed, noting that they could not be ignored. After reviewing the evidence and Jamal's arguments, the judge made his decision. The charges were dismissed. A quiet gasp spread across the room, followed by an almost immediate stillness. It wasn't a loud celebration, but a shared understanding of what had just happened. Jamal had not only defended himself, he had shifted the entire direction of the case through clarity, discipline, and truth. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then the judge added something unexpected. He encouraged Jamal to continue pursuing law, acknowledging that his knowledge, composure, and determination were qualities that belonged in the legal profession. It was more than recognition, it was validation. Jamal nodded respectfully, his expression unchanged, but his eyes reflecting the weight of the moment. He thanked the court not with excitement or triumph, but with quiet gratitude. Because for him, this was never just about winning. It was about being treated fairly, about proving that intelligence and character cannot be judged by age, race, or appearance. As he turned to leave, members of the audience watched him differently than they had when he first walked in. Some offered small nods of support. Others simply looked on, thoughtful, as if reconsidering beliefs they had never questioned before. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter. Word of what had happened began to spread quickly, first through whispers in the hallway, then through conversations, and eventually beyond the building itself. People spoke not just about a case being dismissed, but about a teenager who stood alone and commanded a courtroom with knowledge and courage. The story became a reminder that change doesn't always begin with grand speeches or large movements. Sometimes it begins with one person refusing to be underestimated. In the days that followed, Jamal returned to his routine, but something had shifted. Teachers noticed his focus, community members recognized his determination, and opportunities slowly began to open. Mentors reached out. Scholarships were mentioned. People who once might have overlooked him now saw potential. And through it all, Jamal remained grounded. He continued studying, continuing learning, holding on to the belief that the law should protect people, not intimidate them. That knowledge should empower, not divide. The moment in that courtroom didn't just change how others saw Jamal. It changed how he saw his own future. What started as a day of judgment became the foundation of purpose. The laughter he faced had turned into respect. The doubt had turned into belief. And the teenager who once stood alone in front of a judge walked forward with something far greater than victory. A clear path, a powerful voice, and the unwavering determination to become the kind of attorney who ensures that no one else is ever dismissed before they are heard.